At 11:22 in the evening, Washington time, a convoy of black SUVs pulled quietly into the underground entrance of the Eisenhower Executive Office building adjacent to the West Wing. No press briefing had been scheduled, no public statement had been issued, but inside one of the most secure conference rooms in the American capital, a meeting was already underway that would shape the trajectory of American foreign policy for years to come. Senior national security advisors, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the director of national intelligence had all been summoned within a 40-minute window. Their phones were collected at the door. The agenda, according to two individuals briefed on the proceedings, contained a single word at the top of the page. One word that has haunted American presidents for decades: Iran. What has unfolded in the weeks since the United States conducted its most significant military strike against Iranian territory in modern history is not simply a regional crisis, it is a systemic rupture in the architecture of global order, and the consequences are spreading outward at a pace that even the most seasoned analysts were not fully prepared for. If you are trying to understand why the world feels more unstable than it did 6 months ago, this is the story you need to hear in full. Because what is happening right now is not a contained military exchange between two adversaries. It is the beginning of a profound realignment in global politics, in energy markets, in alliance structures, and in the domestic political calculations of every major power on Earth. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the distant beginning, not the Iranian Revolution of 1979, not the nuclear deal of 2015, but the specific sequence of decisions and miscalculations that brought us to this precise and dangerous moment. Earlier this year, intelligence assessments circulating within the National Security Council painted a picture of an Iran that had crossed a threshold. For years, Washington had operated on the assumption that Iran's nuclear program was a problem to be managed, delayed, negotiated around. The strategy was containment through diplomacy, punctuated by sanctions pressure, and backstopped by the quiet understanding that military action remained on the table as a last resort. But that last resort, somewhere in the early months of this year, began to look less like a resort and more like an imminent necessity. Multiple independent intelligence services, including those of Israel, France, and the United Kingdom, converged on a shared assessment. Iran had enriched enough uranium to a sufficient level that the window for meaningful intervention was narrowing, and narrowing fast. The phrase used in one classified document, later described to reporters in broad terms by a former senior official, was that the clock had moved from months to weeks. Within the Trump White House, this assessment landed with enormous weight. The president had returned to office carrying a very specific set of convictions about the Middle East. He had brokered normalization agreements in his first term, he had withdrawn from the Iran nuclear deal, he had authorized the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and he had returned to the presidency with an explicit promise to his political base and to his Israeli partners that he would not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon on his watch. That promise was now being tested in the most direct way imaginable. The decision to strike did not happen overnight. What the leaked accounts of those internal White House meetings reveal is a process that was far messier, far more contested, and far more anxious than any official account will ever admit. There were voices of caution. The Secretary of Defense, according to individuals familiar with his private communications, raised serious concerns about escalation pathways. The intelligence community flagged the unpredictability of Iranian retaliation. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs reportedly presented 3 scenarios, and only one of them could be characterized as anything close to controlled. But the president made his decision, and in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, American B-2 stealth bombers, accompanied by a coordinated Israeli air operation, struck a series of targets deep inside Iranian territory, including underground enrichment facilities, command infrastructure, and what the Pentagon described as military installations linked to the Revolutionary Guard. The immediate reaction in Tehran was silence. Not the silence of submission, the silence of shock, followed very quickly by the silence of calculation. And here is what most people are missing when they analyze that initial silence. Iran's strategic culture does not respond to military strikes the way Western observers expect. The Islamic Republic has a long institutional memory of absorbing severe blows and then responding asymmetrically, at a time and in a manner of its own choosing. The question in those first 48 hours was never whether Iran would respond. It was where, when, and through which of its many proxies and instruments of retaliation. The answer came in stages, and each stage sent a new shockwave through a different part of the global system. Within 72 hours of the initial strike, Houthi forces in Yemen launched a wave of ballistic missiles towards Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. 3 struck within the perimeter of a major Saudi oil processing facility, though the Saudis initially disputed the severity of the damage. Simultaneously, Hezbollah in Lebanon began its most intense missile campaign against northern Israel in years, drawing Israeli air defenses into a grueling exchange that consumed resources and political attention. In Iraq, Iran-backed militia groups struck 2 American military outposts with drone attacks. No American fatalities were initially reported, but the message was unmistakable. Iran was pulling every lever it had simultaneously, and it was doing so with a coordination that suggested the retaliation plans had been prepared well in advance of the strike. And then, 11 days after the initial American strike, something happened that none of the war game scenarios in Washington had fully anticipated. A commercial tanker registered in the Marshall Islands carrying crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz was struck by what the United States Navy initially described as an undersea mine. The tanker did not sink, but it was disabled. Within 24 hours, 2 additional vessels reported similar incidents. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day, had effectively become a contested war zone. Shipping insurance rates for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf spiked by figures that analysts were struggling to track in real time. 3 major shipping companies announced the suspension of regular transits through the strait pending a security assessment. Within a week of the tanker incidents, crude oil prices had risen by 38% from their pre-strike levels. This is the moment the war ceased to be a regional military event and became a global economic crisis. In Beijing, the response was immediate and revealing. China imports roughly 40% of its crude oil, and a significant share of that oil transits through the Persian Gulf. The Chinese Foreign Ministry released a statement condemning what it called unilateral military aggression and calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities. But behind that diplomatic language, something far more consequential was in motion. According to reporting from multiple sources with visibility into Chinese government deliberations, Beijing accelerated a series of conversations with Riyadh, with Moscow, and with Tehran itself about alternative frameworks for energy security in a post-American dominance Middle East. The Chinese were not simply reacting to a crisis, they were looking at the crisis as an inflection point, an opportunity to demonstrate that the American security architecture in the Middle East, which has underwritten global energy flows for decades, was no longer reliable. Russia's reaction was equally calculated and in some ways even more dangerous. Moscow had its own reasons to welcome American entanglement in a prolonged Middle Eastern conflict. A United States consumed by military operations and diplomatic fallout in the Persian Gulf was a United States with less capacity to focus on Ukraine, less capacity to supply European allies, and less capacity to maintain the level of political pressure that had made Russian operations increasingly costly. The Kremlin released a statement expressing serious concern about destabilization and called for an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, knowing full well that any meaningful resolution would be vetoed, but using the forum to position Russia as a responsible actor seeking dialogue while privately signaling to Tehran that Moscow's support, diplomatic, economic, and potentially material, was available. Here is what the confluence of these reactions tells us. The Trump administration walked into this strike believing, or at least hoping, that a decisive military demonstration would collapse Iran's nuclear ambitions, deter further escalation, and consolidate American credibility in the region. What they have gotten instead is a situation in which the costs of the strike are continuing to compound while the strategic benefits remain uncertain. The enrichment facilities that were destroyed will take time to rebuild, but intelligence analysts are already noting that Iran dispersed elements of its program before the strike, a contingency it had clearly been planning for. The nuclear program has been set back, by how much is genuinely disputed, Estimates range from 1 year to 5 years, and the Iranian government has now publicly withdrawn from any remaining obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, declaring in a speech by the Supreme Leader that Iran reserves every right to defend its sovereignty by any means available. In other words, the strike may have delayed the very outcome it was designed to prevent while simultaneously removing any remaining diplomatic framework for managing it. Inside those urgent meetings in Washington, according to the accounts that have been pieced together from multiple sources familiar with the discussions, there is a growing and uncomfortable recognition of this paradox. The president remains publicly defiant. His public statements emphasize strength, resolve, and the elimination of the Iranian nuclear threat, but the internal conversations are more conflicted. Senior advisors are divided between those who believe the United States must now escalate further to prevent Iran from reconstituting its program, and those who believe the priority must shift to de-escalation before the regional conflict draws in additional major powers. This is not a theoretical debate, it is a live and urgent disagreement at the highest levels of American national security decision-making, and its outcome will shape everything that follows. The economic dimension of this crisis deserves more attention than it is receiving in the daily news cycle, because it is through the economy that the political consequences will ultimately be felt most broadly. Energy markets are only the most visible symptom. The deeper issue is what sustained elevated oil prices due to an already fragile global economic environment. The International Monetary Fund had already revised its global growth projections downward twice in the previous 12 months. Central banks in Europe, Asia, and North America were navigating the aftershocks of inflation cycles that had proven more persistent than expected. Against this backdrop, an oil price spike of the magnitude currently underway does not land on stable ground. It lands on economies that are already stretched, on governments that are already politically vulnerable, and on populations that are already angry. In Europe, the reaction has been split in ways that reveal deep fault lines within the transatlantic alliance. The United Kingdom, publicly at least, expressed understanding of the rationale for the strike while calling for diplomatic engagement to prevent further escalation. France and Germany issued a joint statement that was notably cooler in its language, expressing deep concern about the unilateral nature of the American action and its consequences for regional stability. This is not simply diplomatic protocol. It reflects a genuine and deepening divergence in strategic outlook between Washington and its European partners, a divergence that has been building for years and that this crisis has now brought into sharp relief. European governments are looking at an energy price shock at a moment of political fragility at home, and they are looking at an American administration that made a decision with profound global consequences without meaningful consultation with its closest allies. That is a combination that produces lasting damage to alliance cohesion. The Gulf Arab states present a more complex picture. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have publicly expressed support for preventing Iranian nuclear capability, a position they have held consistently for years. But private Saudi communications, fragments of which have leaked in various forms, suggest a deep unease about the unpredictability of what follows. The Houthi strikes on Saudi territory were a direct reminder that Riyadh sits within the blast radius of any escalation Iran chooses to pursue. The Saudis want Iran's nuclear program contained. They do not want a regional war that leaves their oil infrastructure in flames and their domestic stability threatened. Israel's position is perhaps the most psychologically complex of any actor in this crisis. The Israeli government participated directly in the initial strike and has publicly proclaimed it a historic achievement in the defense of Israeli and regional security. But within Israeli security and intelligence circles, the conversation is considerably more nuanced. Hezbollah's ongoing missile campaign against northern Israel is not simply a tactical inconvenience. It represents a sustained drain on Israeli air defense capabilities and a humanitarian and economic disruption that Israeli society is absorbing at real cost. The Israeli government faces a political calculation that pulls in two directions simultaneously. Continuing to prosecute aggressive operations demonstrates strength and resolve to a domestic audience that demands it, but continuing operations also sustains a level of conflict that exhausts resources and deepens international isolation, particularly in Europe and among Arab states that Israel has spent years cultivating. The historical parallels being drawn in academic and analytical circles are worth examining. frightening because they illuminate the structural dynamics at work in ways that current events sometimes obscure. Some analysts are reaching back to the Suez Crisis of 1956, when American intervention to halt British and French military action in Egypt fundamentally reordered the post-war alliance structure. The relevant parallel is not military but political. In 1956, America's unilateral assertion of its own preferred order over the objections of its allies produced a lasting shift in how those allies calibrated their dependence on American leadership. Something similar may be occurring now, but with the roles partially reversed. It is American unilateralism that is straining the alliance, and the question is whether allies will recalibrate their strategic autonomy accordingly. Others are drawing parallels to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the similarities are uncomfortable for the administration. A decisive initial military operation justified on the basis of weapons of mass destruction, an initial phase that appeared to succeed, and then a cascading series of consequences that had not been adequately planned for. The Bush administration believed that the fall of Baghdad would produce a democratic domino effect across the Middle East. The Trump administration appears to have believed that the destruction of Iran's nuclear facilities would produce a collapse of Iranian adventurism and a consolidation of a new regional order. History suggests that military strikes rarely produce the political transformations their architects envision. The Vietnam parallel is being raised in a different context, specifically in relation to the domestic political dynamics inside the United States. The Trump administration entered this operation with strong polling support among its base for a muscular posture toward Iran. But as the costs of the operation compound, as oil prices strain American household budgets, as the prospect of sustained regional conflict becomes impossible to ignore, the political calculus is beginning to shift. Opposition figures in Congress are calling for hearings. Some Republican voices, particularly those with libertarian instincts or constituencies vulnerable to energy price inflation, are beginning to ask questions that were unthinkable a month ago. How long does this continue? What is the exit strategy? What does victory actually look like? These are questions that the White House meetings are also wrestling with, and the fact that they are being asked at all represents a significant shift in the political environment. Let us now turn to the scenarios, because what matters most at this point is not what has already happened, but what is likely to happen next, and understanding the range of possible futures is the most important analytical work that can be done. The first scenario, which might be called controlled degradation, envisions the current level of conflict persisting but not significantly escalating. In this scenario, Iran continues to use its proxy network to impose costs on American, Israeli, and Gulf Arab interests, but does not take any action so direct or so severe that it triggers another major American military operation. The United States maintains its military posture in the region, conducts occasional targeted strikes against specific high-value targets, but does not launch a ground campaign or another strategic bombing campaign. Oil markets remain elevated but gradually stabilize as shipping companies adapt their routes and insurance markets price in the new risk environment. This scenario is uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it is survivable. The probability of this scenario is meaningful, perhaps the most likely single outcome, precisely because it requires the least dramatic decision from any party. Sustained low-level conflict is often the path of least resistance when no party has the capacity or the willingness to force a decisive outcome. The second scenario involves significant escalation, and it is the one that keeps senior officials awake at night. In this scenario, Iran makes a strategic decision to escalate qualitatively, not just quantitatively. This could take several forms: a direct Iranian military strike on American forces in the region rather than through proxies, a major attack on Saudi or Emirati infrastructure that genuinely disrupts global oil supply, or, most alarmingly, an acceleration of what remains of the Iranian nuclear program in a manner that forces the United States into another military decision on an even shorter timeline. Any one of these developments would dramatically change the calculus and likely trigger a level of American military response that could bring the United States and Iran into direct and sustained conflict. The probability of this scenario is lower than the controlled degradation scenario, but it is not negligible. Iranian decision-making is not always rational by Western Western standards of rationality, and the internal politics of the Islamic Republic create their own pressures toward demonstrating strength. The third scenario is the one that most geopolitical strategists consider simultaneously the most consequential and the least discussed in mainstream coverage. This is the scenario in which the crisis becomes the occasion for a fundamental restructuring of the global order. In this scenario, China moves aggressively to position itself as the alternative security guarantor in the Middle East, deepening its relationships with the Gulf states and with Iran simultaneously, and using its economic leverage to pull energy-exporting countries away from the American-dominated security architecture. This is not a sudden event, it is a process that unfolds over months and years. But the current crisis could be the accelerant that pushes that process past a critical threshold. Russia deepens its own engagement with Iran and uses its influence in Syria and other theaters to tie down American and Allied attention. European governments facing their own economic pressures and political instability begin to explore strategic autonomy from Washington in more serious institutional terms than they have previously been willing to pursue. In this scenario, the legacy of the Iran strike is not a more secure Middle East, it is the beginning of the end of the post-Cold War American-led international order. The fourth scenario is the one the administration is publicly hoping for and privately uncertain about. In this scenario, the combination of military pressure, economic sanctions, and the demonstrated willingness to use force produces a political fracture inside Iran. The argument runs that the regime is already under severe economic stress, that the Iranian population is deeply unhappy with its government, and that a major military blow combined with sustained pressure could produce the conditions for political change inside Iran. This scenario is not impossible. Authoritarian regimes do sometimes collapse under sustained pressure, but the historical record is not encouraging. Military strikes on authoritarian states have more often produced nationalist rallying effects than political collapse. And the Iranian regime, for all its problems, retains the loyalty of enough of its security apparatus and ideological core to suppress internal dissent with considerable brutality. The fifth and final scenario is the one that would represent the most genuinely positive outcome, but also the one that currently seems furthest from realization. This is the scenario in which the strike and its aftermath produce conditions for a comprehensive diplomatic settlement. In this scenario, Iran, faced with the destruction of its nuclear infrastructure and the prospect of continued military pressure, agrees to engage in substantive negotiations on a deal that would place its nuclear activities under rigorous and verifiable international oversight, in exchange for meaningful sanctions, relief, and security guarantees. The United States, recognizing the cost of sustained conflict, agrees to negotiate in good faith. Intermediaries, perhaps including China and European governments, provide the diplomatic architecture for those negotiations. This scenario requires a level of political courage from both Washington and Tehran that currently appears to exceed the capacity of either government. It requires the Trump administration to be willing to negotiate with the regime it has publicly declared an existential threat. It requires the Iranian government to engage with the country that just struck its territory without a declaration of war. The obstacles are enormous, but it is worth noting that some of the most significant diplomatic breakthroughs in history came precisely in the aftermath of military escalation, when all parties had been reminded of the costs of continued conflict. And so we return to those meetings in Washington, those dark-suited figures in a secured conference room, phones collected, a single word at the top of the agenda, because the decisions being made in those rooms over the coming weeks will determine which of these scenarios becomes reality. And the individuals making those decisions are operating under conditions of extreme uncertainty, extreme political pressure, and the full weight of historical awareness that the choices made in moments like this one are the choices that shape the world for decades. The Trump administration has staked its foreign policy legacy on the proposition that strength and decisiveness produce better outcomes than the cautious multilateralism of its predecessors. That proposition is now being tested in the most direct way imaginable. The strike happened. The consequences are unfolding. The proxies are active, the markets are shaken, the alliances are strained, and the adversaries are watching with a combination of anxiety and strategic opportunism. The question is no longer whether this was the right decision. The question is what happens now. What is clear from everything we know about the internal deliberations, about the intelligence assessments, about the behavior of the key actors, is that this situation is not moving toward a quick resolution. The dynamics at play are too deep, the interests too conflicting, the mistrust too entrenched. What we are watching is the beginning of a prolonged and genuinely dangerous period in which the rules of the international order are being contested in real time through the most consequential instruments available to states. The world has been through moments like this before: the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, the Yom Kippur War. In each of those moments, the outcome was not determined by the initial escalation. It was determined by the quality of decision-making in the rooms where the critical choices were made in the days and weeks that followed. In some of those moments, decision-makers found the wisdom, the restraint, and the creativity to pull the world back from the brink. In others, they did not. There are serious, experienced people in Washington, in Tehran, in Beijing, in Moscow, in Brussels, and in Jerusalem who understand the stakes. There are also serious, experienced people in all of those capitals who are willing to accept enormous risks in pursuit of strategic advantage. The contest between those two groups, the cautious and the bold, the restrainers and the escalators, is the story that will define the next phase of this crisis. And for everyone watching from outside those rooms, from every country whose economy depends on the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, from every nation whose security depends on the stability of the alliances that underwrite global order, from every citizen who will pay more at the pump, worry more about the security of their country, and wonder more about the world their children will inherit, the outcome of that contest matters enormously. The convoy that arrived at the Eisenhower Executive Office building that evening was not carrying the answer. It was carrying the question. And the answer, whenever it comes, will not be found in a single meeting, or a single strike, or a single diplomatic initiative. It will emerge from the cumulative weight of decisions made under pressure by people carrying more power than certainty, more responsibility than confidence, in a world that is more dangerous today than it was when the year began. That is the reality of what is unfolding, and anyone who tells you they know exactly how it ends is not being honest with you. What we can say with confidence is this: the stakes are real, the consequences are already being felt, and the choices being made right now, in those rooms, behind those closed doors, with those phones left at the entrance, will echo for a very long time.